all 11 billion. That is what FIFA expects to earn from the 2026 World Cup. 11 billion flowing to a non-profit organization headquartered in Switzerland. And the cities that made it possible. The cities that built the fan zones, upgraded the stadiums, deployed the security, and reshaped their infrastructure around this tournament. They get essentially nothing back. Not a percentage. Not a share. Zero. One person who has watched this dynamic up close for decades put it simply and clearly. Everybody signed an agreement that was very, very one-sided. That was Alan Rothenberg, the man who ran United States soccer the last time America hosted a World Cup in 1994. He knows exactly what a hosting agreement looks like when it works for cities and what it looks like when it doesn't, and his verdict on 2026 is unambiguous. Very, very one-sided. So here is the question that should be sitting at the top of every football news agenda today, 3 days before the opening match. If FIFA is making $11 billion from this tournament, and the host cities are facing hundreds of millions in losses, who really pays for the World Cup? The answer is not complicated, but it is deeply uncomfortable. The answer is the taxpayers. The people who live in the 11 American host cities. The people who did not negotiate the hosting agreement. Who were not in the room when the terms were set. Who will be paying off the costs of this tournament long after the trophy is lifted in New Jersey on July 19th. Let us start with the fundamental structure of this arrangement, because everything else flows from it. FIFA retains all revenue generated from World Cup matches, leaving host cities to recover their costs through other means. Everything goes to FIFA in Zurich, not to the city whose stadium is being used, not to the local economy that is being disrupted, not to the taxpayers whose money funded the security, the infrastructure, and the retrofitting that made the match possible. Everything to FIFA. The cities and their local organizing committees pay for security at the matches, cover the cost of retrofitting their stadiums to better accommodate soccer, and operate fan festivals in addition to the main matches. So the cities pay for everything around the match, and FIFA takes everything from the match. That is the deal. That is what 11 American cities signed up for. And the contrast between those two facts, FIFA's $11 billion in revenue and the city's hundreds of millions in costs, is the financial reality sitting underneath all the excitement about the football itself. It was not always this way. Rothenberg explained what 1994 looked like compared to 2026. Back then, some host cities would get a slice of game day revenues, a share of the money made from selling food and drinks at the matches. United States Soccer also covered the bill for security at the games and other organizing expenses. That helped cities take in more money than they spent. Hosting was worth doing. The deal made sense for both sides. The 2026 deal is different. Different enough that one city looked at what was being asked and said no. Chicago, one of the great American cities, a city with genuine football culture, a passionate sporting public, and the infrastructure to host a World Cup, looked at the hosting agreement and decided the numbers did not work. That the cost it would be asked to bear and the revenues it would be prohibited from sharing made the whole exercise a bad deal for the people who pay Chicago's bills. So Chicago walked away. The cities that stayed: Dallas, Houston, Los Angeles, New York, Seattle, San Francisco, Kansas City, Boston, Philadelphia, Miami, and Atlanta. They stayed for their own reasons. Civic prestige, tourism projections, the hope of long-term economic benefits that the exposure of a World Cup generates. Those are not unreasonable reasons, but the costs are real, and they are considerably easier to measure than the benefits. In the United States, FEMA awarded $625 million in security funding to the 11 host cities, $605 million in federal security grants alone, and that number, significant as it is, may not be enough. An economist who has studied the economics of major sporting events for decades said the federal grants available to cities are not nearly enough to deal with the potential security problems, with cities facing significant security expenses and receiving essentially zero revenues directly from the tournament. Many are likely to incur losses, essentially zero revenues. Those are not the words of a critic with an agenda. That is an economist telling you what the financial reality looks like from the city's perspective. While some costs may be offset through local sponsorships and private donations, taxpayers will ultimately bear much of the remaining burden. Taxpayers, the people who live in these cities, who did not sign the hosting agreement, who were not in the room. They are the ones carrying the financial weight of a tournament that generates the $11 billion for an organization headquartered in Switzerland. The Texas story is particularly instructive because Texas has been here before. When Texas dedicated $22 million to host the 2017 Super Bowl, State officials expected a return on their investment, but a state analysis after the game said it was impossible to tell if Texas taxpayers broke even. If anything, Texas came up a $14 million short. The $14 million short on a single Super Bowl, and now Texas is hosting World Cup matches in both Houston and Dallas at a scale that makes the Super Bowl look like a warm-up act. The pattern from 1994 is worth understanding too, because the last time the United States hosted a World Cup, the economic picture was considerably more favorable for the cities involved. The deal Rothenberg described, where cities received a share of revenues and had their security costs covered, meant that hosting genuinely worked as a financial proposition. Cities came out ahead, or at least broke even. The shift between 1994 and 2026 in how FIFA structures its host city agreements reflects something important about how the organization has evolved. As FIFA's revenues have grown from hundreds of millions per tournament to the billions it now generates, its willingness to share those revenues with the cities that make the tournament possible has apparently moved in the opposite direction. The $11 billion in projected revenue from 2026 is an extraordinary number. And the cities generating that revenue, through their stadiums, their infrastructure, their security deployments, their public services, they get essentially none of it back directly. 100% of ticket sales go to FIFA in Zurich. 100%, not 90, 100. And then there are the transport costs, which became their own story in the weeks before the tournament. New Jersey Transit announced that round-trip train fares from New York's Penn Station to MetLife Stadium would cost $150 on match days, more than 11 times the normal $12.90 fare. 11 times the normal fare. To get to a match you already spent hundreds of dollars to attend. The pressure on transport costs was a direct consequence of the security and operational expenses that cities were carrying without revenue from the matches themselves. The cost had to come from somewhere, and it came from the fans who were already paying FIFA's inflated ticket prices to get through the gate. The backlash was significant enough that the fare was eventually reduced, but the principle it illustrated, that the financial structure of this tournament pushes costs down from FIFA to cities, and from cities to fans, remained unchanged. Now let us look at the broader picture through the lens of Vancouver, because the Canadian hosting situation offers a useful comparison point that illuminates the American experience. Hosting 2026 World Cup games in Vancouver cost between $532 and $624 million, with costs expected to be offset by $448 to $478 million in estimated revenues and recoveries. So Vancouver is hosting 7 matches, spending up to $624 million, and expecting to recover roughly $40 to $60 million of that, leaving a gap of somewhere between $50 and $176 million, depending on how the economics of attendance actually materialize. And Vancouver's deal may actually be more favorable than what American cities face, because the Canadian, provincial, and federal governments have been more directly involved in underwriting the costs and negotiating the terms. The fundamental question that this tournament raises, a question that goes beyond 2026 to every future World Cup, is whether this financial structure is sustainable and whether it is fair. FIFA is a non-profit organization. That is its legal status, and yet it is projecting $11 billion in revenue from a single tournament, taking 100% of ticket sales, and leaving the cities that host those matches to absorb hundreds of millions in costs with essentially no direct share of the revenues their infrastructure makes possible. The economist Andrew Zimbalist, who has spent his career studying the economics of major sporting events, has been clear about what this means in practice. Cities facing significant security expenses and receiving essentially zero revenues are likely to incur losses. The taxpayers of those cities are bearing costs that the tournament's revenue could easily absorb if the financial structure were designed differently. It was not designed differently because the people who designed it were optimizing for FIFA's revenue, not for the city's return on investment. The person who said, "Everybody signed an agreement that was very, very one-sided," Rothenberg, was there in 1994 when the deal was better, when cities shared in the revenues, when the financial relationship between FIFA and its host cities resembled a partnership rather than an arrangement where one party takes the money and the other takes the bill. Something changed between 1994 and 2026. The tournament got bigger, the revenues got bigger, and the city's share of those revenues went to zero. That is the story behind the $111 billion number, behind the stadiums filling with fans who paid prices that an attorney general is now investigating, behind the transport surcharges and the security costs and the budget gaps that taxpayers across 11 American cities will be managing long after the final whistle blows on July 19th. The football will be extraordinary. It almost always is at a World Cup. The matches will produce moments that people will talk about for decades. The players will give everything they have on pitches that will be prepared to the highest standards in stadiums that the host cities have spent hundreds of millions to make ready, and FIFA will take all the ticket money. Think about that the next time you watch a match from one of these cities. The stadium around you, maintained, modified, prepared, was paid for in large part by the people who live there. The security keeping the event safe was funded by federal grants and local tax revenues. The transport getting fans to the ground was repriced to cover costs that the tournament's own revenue structure left unaddressed. The $11 billion goes to Zurich, and the cities and the fans and the taxpayers get the bill. Would it change how you think about this tournament if FIFA shared even a portion of its revenues with the cities that make it possible? Leave me your thoughts in the comments. This is a conversation the football world needs to have before the next hosting agreement is signed. If you found this worth your time, a like helps more than you think. Subscribe if you enjoy thoughtful football coverage. I read every comment. See you in the next one.